the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College. And surprised by joy, he says, I kept saying to God, why can't you heal my mother? And when she died, he said, I sort of rejected God as a magician. Here I was trying to get him to do magic to save my mother, and he didn't do it. So if you look at it, most of his fiction has some attempt to grapple with his mother's death. There's kind of this great monumental grieving experience. He actually says when she died, there was still much happiness, but the great continent had sunk like Atlantis. And then in this story, this Atlantean magic, the way you get to Narnia and these other worlds is through Atlantean magic. So it's amazing how he interwove literature, scripture, mythology, and his own life experiences into this seamless story.
Yeah.
You can enjoy the story without knowing anything about Lewis. But almost every page, something about Lewis's backstory is in that.
Welcome. This is Crystal and David Downing sitting down with our producer, Aaron Hill, to discuss the 6th Narnia Chronicle, The Magician's Nephew. And to begin, I want to talk about various forms of beginnings. First of all, this is the Narnia Chronicle that is about the beginning, the creation of Narnia. But before we get there, I want to talk about beginnings in terms of Lewis's composition process and then the very beginning of the novel, the first page of the novel. So why don't we start? David, what do you know about the composition process of this novel?
Well, first of all, are we sitting down with Aaron or is Aaron sitting down with us?
We're sitting down together, but
Yes.
I am in your basement. So.
Oh, okay. Well, this actually was meant to be the sequel to Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. His friend Roger Lancelin Green said, how did that lamppost get up there in the middle of nowhere?
Oh, it was going to be the second book.
Yes. And so he said, well, I'm going to write a story in which I explain how that lamppost came to be there. This is the only chronicle in which there's a major fragment that he didn't use. It's called the LaFay fragment.
Oh.
And his original idea, there's a little boy named Digory, and he has a mean aunt named Gertrude. And when she was a school mistress, she bullied the children. And then when she was a headmistress, she bullied the mistresses. And then she became a supervisor and bullied the schools and eventually went to Parliament so she could bully everybody.
We talked about that last time.
Right.
Oh.
But that satiric thing gets moved over to the ending of Silver Chair.
Oh.
So this is actually a different passage.
Which is interesting because one of the things we talked about last time is how Silver Chair ended differently than the preceding Narnia Chronicles. And it must be because he decided to transfer that material to Silver Chair.
Yeah, this is why you should never throw away drafts. The LaFay fragment in itself doesn't work, but it has a lot of material that he was able to use elsewhere in the Chronicles.
And the theme of bullying is a theme in Silver Chair.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the name LaFay occurs in this novel.
It does. It's called the LaFay fragment. Let me finish the summary and then we'll talk about it.
We're just so excited.
Exactly. What does C.S. Lewis stand for? Clive Staples. So there's this little boy who has the mean Aunt Gertrude, and he can talk to trees and animals. He can go to the backyard and talk to the oak tree and talk to the squirrel, whose name is Pattertwig, which shows up again in Prince Caspian.
Yeah.
And the little girl next door, Polly, is building a raft. And she said, I need a cross piece for the raft. Can you cut a limb off that oak tree? And Digory says, well, I don't want to do that. But he sort of wants to help Polly and be her friend. So he goes ahead and starts sawing off the limb of an oak tree. And the oak tree slaps him. And then he goes ahead and finishes it. He gives it to her so she can make a raft. And the next day he goes out to apologize to the oak tree. And he discovers that he's lost the ability to talk to trees and animals.
Oh, wow.
So then this fat lady who says she's the fairy godmother named Mrs. LaFay shows up. And she says, well, I can see that you've lost your ability to communicate. If you go to my shop, you will find... And then he suddenly ends in mid-sentence. Quit the fragment after 26 pages.
Oh, no.
So we have Mrs. LaFay, we have the mean Aunt Gertrude, we have Digory and Polly, but we don't know why. He didn't say, here's why I quit. Authors should be more considerate of scholars.
Yeah.
But my main theory is that where did Digory get these magical powers before when the story already began? Everything in Narnia is a portal. You start out in our normal everyday world, and then something happens which propels you into Narnia or the world of marvels.
Yeah.
So I believe he was thinking, well, this doesn't fit the way I write fantasy fiction, that he already has these magical powers as a kid, and we don't know why.
Do you think maybe LaFay was supposed to be like a had fairy blood, and maybe he was a descendant of her or something. Maybe.
I think that's where he was going.
That's what it says in this novel.
Yeah.
That's the
Gotcha.
godmother of Uncle Andrew.
So, David, for those that are interested, is there a place where people could go read the LaFay fragment? Has that been published someplace?
Yes, it's in Walter Hooper's Past Watchful Dragons.
Okay.
He gives that LaFay fragment.
And explain LaFay.
Well, it means the fairy. Morgan Le Fay is kind of Arthur's evil sister in
Morgan
Arthurian
Le Fay.
legend.
Okay.
And so Le Fay tends to be some kind of an evil force that is working against the goodness of Arthur and the Round Table.
Right.
Huh.
So clearly, she seemed to be a good character, but very comical. Roger Lancelin Green read this fragment and said, "Aren't you getting too into parody?" That was another thing that made him think this wasn't a great start. So, but as we know, Mrs. Le Fay here also dabbles in magic. And he says, well, she got shut up somewhere. And Digory says, oh, in a mental institution? No, just in prison.
Yeah.
So anyway.
That Uncle Andrew calls her, well, I actually had a fairy godmother.
Yeah.
And I just have to insert this one little thing. David and I have a godson back in Pennsylvania. And when he was 3 years old, I would tell him, well, Jude, I'm your fairy godmother. And so he'd go to nursery school and tell all the other children, well, I have a fairy godmother.
Aww.
And then the other children would go home crying to their parents and saying, why don't I have a fairy godmother? So the parents had to tell me to stop saying that.
Oh, my gosh.
You're only the godmother.
Oh,
Not
wow.
the fairy godmother.
Well, and
the parents said, well, she may be a godmother, but she's probably evil.
Well, and David, that idea of talking to trees and losing the ability of talking to trees also appears in Prince Caspian. So he doesn't really discard any of those ideas, does he?
That's right. He doesn't. As you read through them, you say, this is a great imaginative workshop for works that he would later put it in a better context.
Yeah.
Make it more effective than the fragment was.
Yeah, and it's the concepts that he uses elsewhere as opposed to just thinking like, oh, the storyline is like I have to use this idea from cutting a limb off of a tree or something. Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, even the names. He had another part of this Le Fay fragment, which we've lost, where the kids go off into a world and it's like Piers Plowman. It's like the Middle Ages. And everybody speaks in Chaucerian English.
Oh.
And once again, his friend Roger Lancelin Green said, no, Jack, this is
this is for children.
We don't want Middle English in the Narnia
Well, he
Chronicles.
indulges himself a little bit at the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the way that they talk.
Oh, that's right.
More,
manner.
Yeah.
It goes a little bit above the heads of
more
kids right there.
Jacobean English.
Well, apparently this was even further along in terms of difficult language.
Well, yeah.
I wish we had the fragment,
Wow.
Juan Rapel with Chora Sota, the droch of March hath Persa de the Rota.
Oh, I wish that was in Narnia. That would be great.
That's the beginning of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales.
They go into the wardrobe and they hear people talking like that, and they go, let's go back out.
Abort.
Exactly. It's a very short story.
So, David, we don't know why he quit that day. It could have been that somebody, his housekeeper, turned on the Hoover vacuum, which makes a reappearance in this novel.
Yes, that's right.
But
product placement, clear back in the 50s.
Well, it's like Coleridge writing Kubla Khan and says someone from Porlock interrupted him and he never could finish the poem.
Oh, wow.
So there are actually, it's a tourist site to go to Porlock in England to find this location where someone came and interrupted one of the great possible poems in the English language. Anyway, go back, David.
So
why did he? So why did he not finish this?
Well, he was writing The Magician's Nephew the same time he was writing Surprised by Joy. And so obviously he's going back, he's thinking about his childhood, he's thinking about his schooling, and there's a lot of painful memories back there. This boarding school headmaster named Robert Capron, who he calls Oldie in Surprised by Joy, in the last couple of years of his life, he wrote to somebody and said, I've finally forgiven a man who traumatized me in my childhood.
Wow.
And he's thinking of this headmaster from 50 years earlier.
Yeah.
So I believe he had trouble with it as a sequel.
And that, of course, is then embodied in Uncle Andrew.
Exactly.
This novel.
He says in Surprised by Joy, our father never understood what a monster he was because we always portrayed him as a buffoon. And he actually said in a letter, Robert Capron would make a good villain in a story. And when he was a teenager, he said that. So 40 years later, just to remind you of the similarities, Robert Capron was about 60, which is
Uncle Andrews
says he's 60.
Oh, wow.
He said he had mincing speech and he dropped his R's, like she's a dim, fine woman, she's a fine gal.
Well, thank you.
He bragged about his... he bragged about his family from the south of England, which is more like the East Coast, West Coast. The north and south in England, the south of England thinks of themselves as more settled and civilized than north of England. So he always bragged about his fine Devonshire family. And Uncle Andrew brags about his Dorsetshire family.
Yeah.
And it just goes on and on. It talks about his piercing eyes and his strangely shaped nose and his cunning smile or his Assyrian smile. Even Warren in his family memoirs describes Robert Capron. It sounds exactly like Uncle Andrew.
Oh, wow.
So part of what he's doing, and I think part of the reason it took him so long to write this, is because he was really revisiting some old emotional wounds in writing this story.
Yeah.
And of course, a dying mother.
Yeah, the
Talk
dying
about
mother.
the emotional wounds.
Well, and you get the sense when you're reading Surprised by Joy, especially if you read it second, a third, and a fourth time, that he kind of skips over some things or makes light of some things in places where you go, I think there's more to this that he's not telling, because it's not. He's not trying to reveal all the dirty secrets of his life. He's just kind of glosses over things. But there's definitely, you can tell some pain and some wounds in there.
Yeah. Well, the very first page, he says this story takes place when your grandfather was young, and it was published when he was 57, so he's a grandfatherly age himself.
Yeah.
And then he says the Bastables were still hunting treasures in Lewisham Road. That's an Edith Nesbit story from his childhood. Sherlock Holmes was still solving crimes. So the very first page, he's saying, if you understand his own biography, this all happened when I was a child.
Yeah.
And then later on, Digory becomes Professor Kirk.
I was going to say, Digory feels very autobiographical in this story of Lewis.
His mother's dying. He grows up to be a famous professor who takes in children during the war. Yeah, so I think that's part of the reason he said, let's do something a little bit safer. Let's do Prince Caspian. Let's do Voyage of the Dawn Treader.
Yeah.
It was almost like he was putting it off.
Yeah.
And so even though it was the beginnings of Narnia, it's the last thing he composed. It's the last thing he finished.
Yeah.
It's a strange embodiment of the principle that the first shall be last. We don't hear about the beginnings of Narnia until the last thing he wrote about Narnia.
Well, and we can get back to this later, but I also think that he's wrestling with not just the death of his mother, but I think he's also wrestling with maybe why God didn't answer his prayers to heal his mother when he was young. And so the idea of unanswered prayer is something that pops up here. But that's a thing that he deals with a lot towards the end of his life. I mean, Letters to Malcolm is one of his, his last novels that he wrote before he died. And so that's a thing that he's dealing with here at the end of his life in Surprised by Joy and in this novel and Letters to Malcolm is this idea of why does God not answer our prayers?
Right.
Yeah. So we can get to that later, but.
Well, I agree. And Surprised by Joy, he says, I kept saying to God, why can't you heal my mother? And when she died, he said, I sort of rejected God as a magician. Here I was trying to get him to do magic to save my mother, and he didn't do it. So, if you look at it, most of his fiction has some attempt to grapple with his mother's death. There's kind of this great monumental grieving experience. He actually says when she died, there was still to be much happiness, but the great continent had sunk like Atlantis. And then in this story, this Atlantean magic, the way you get back to the way you get to Narnia and these other worlds is through Atlantean magic. So it's amazing how he interwove literature, scripture, mythology, and his own life experiences into this seamless story.
Yeah.
You can enjoy the story without knowing anything about Lewis, but almost every page, something about Lewis's backstory is in that.
And, one of the things that's always stood out to me when I read the stories is, here you have these children novels, and there's really very few, except for the mother in this story, there's very few positive parent-child portrayals in these stories. And there's a part of me that's kind of like, why didn't Lewis portray that? That's a positive thing that you would want to show to children. But he didn't really have those in his own life. And his life was basically one of being sent off to this foreign, strange land and going on these adventures by himself. He kind of grew up by himself in boarding school. So it makes sense that that's what the children in the stories would be encountering.
And one of the profundities of Digory's desire to save his mother appears later on, where he wants to say to Aslan, I'll try to help you if you'll promise to help about my mother. And it says he had this sense, however, that Aslan wasn't someone who bargained.
Yeah.
And there is a profundity there far more than you might see on the surface, because basically this goes back, it's probably something that the young Jack Lewis was bargaining with God. Oh God, I will read my Bible every day if you'll heal my mother. Who knows what the bargains were?
Yeah.
But this is a basic religious impulse that reduces God to someone you have to negotiate with.
Yeah.
Well, that's one of the stages of grieving in Kubler-Ross. I know a lot of her work has been
Bargaining.
has come under criticism, but that is one of the stages of
Oh, that's a real thing.
dealing with grief.
Yeah.
Bargaining.
Well, let's get back to the beginning of the story.
Okay.
We'll come back to prayer. 'Cause
Exactly.
Let's save the really good stuff for the end.
Well, I want to, since David already mentioned it, that in the very second paragraph, you have an allusion to Sherlock Holmes and to the children in this Edith Nesbit story, which is called The Story of the Treasure Seekers. But both of those kind of set you up. They allude to the construction of this tale because just 2 pages later, we have a reference to a mystery. Is Mr. Ketterly really mad? Well, either he's mad or there's some other mystery. And sure enough, there is a mystery. So the children are kind of like being Sherlock Holmes and they crawl through the attic area, and which is mysterious itself.
Yeah.
But also, they are children who are treasure seekers without knowing it. And the treasure that they discover, of course, is Aslan and this creation of the world of Narnia. And at first you think the treasure is the rings.
Yeah.
But that's not the treasure that they ultimately gain.
Yeah. Well, when they find out that Digory can't go into Uncle Andrew's study, they try and conjecture, as kids do, about why he can't go in there. And so option number 1 is he has a mad wife that he keeps shut up.
Oh, yeah, Jane Eyre.
Which reminds me of Jane Eyre, which we've discussed. And then he references a pirate. Maybe he's a pirate, like the pirate from Treasure Island.
Right.
And then he says maybe he's a coiner. What is a coiner? Is that a thief?
It's a counterfeiter.
Oh. A counterfeiter.
Yeah, so he's up there, making fake money.
Making
or something
fake money.
Right.
Oh, okay. Which is interesting because the coins get planted in Narnia and turn into trees later on.
Right.
Interesting. Okay, all right. I didn't know what a coiner was, and that was one of those things I wanted to ask about. So they climb through this attic, and they realize that they stumble into Uncle Andrew's study, and they have this encounter with him, and he's very menacing there.
He is, locking the door.
Yeah, and he gives this speech about... after Polly gets whisked away to, she just disappears, he gives this speech about how the rules don't apply to him. And it sounds very Nietzschean, very sort of
I
Ubermensch.
thought the same thing.
And it reminds me of, I can't remember if it's Divine or Weston from the Ransom trilogy, where they make similar speeches essentially saying, well, men who are powerful or really smart, or Uncle Andrew calls himself a sage, the rules don't apply to us. He says, rules are for little boys and servants and women and even people in general, but not great sages like him.
Yeah.
Right.
That idea of the Ubermensch, you're exactly right. And he uses the phrase, I have a high and lonely destiny. And then later in the novel, Jadis, the witch, uses the exact same phrase.
Oh, really?
And so Lewis is definitely identifying something about witchcraft, where someone who becomes fascinated with witchcraft, they start tapping into the demonic, and they don't feel that the rules of life apply to them. And so they do become the Ubermensch. And of course, where Nietzsche wrote that, Thus Spake Zarathustra, is where he talked about the death of God.
Yeah.
And it also goes back to the abolition of man, the idea that there's this interweaving tapestry of morals, and you can't emerge above it. And you're quite right. In Out of the Silent Planet, Weston gives a speech, and he says, we have such advances in technology and transportation that we can overcome less developed civilizations.
Yeah.
And when Ransom tries to translate it, he says, we can carry big things and throw them far. Therefore, we have the right to kill you.
Yeah.
And he has the same response. He says, all those fine words mean, you can do whatever you want without worrying about ordinary morality.
And when Uncle Andrew gets transported to this new created realm of Narnia, he just sees all the beauty of creation, and his immediate thought is like that of Divine. He just wants to make money off it.
Oh, he can make money trees.
Right.
Yeah.
And he wants to industrialize, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Okay. So he disappears.
He disappears, and Lewis has this exchange about consent? He doesn't elaborate on it too much, but this idea that Uncle Andrew, he didn't bother to, let Polly know what he was doing. And he's like, you would have me ask the guinea pigs for consent.
Right.
And I thought that was a very interesting and relevant thing that Lewis throws in there. But then he makes this bargain, and Digory has to choose because, let's face it, Uncle Andrew is a coward. He has to choose to go and follow Polly into the sort of unknown.
Right.
And the green ring takes them there, and the yellow ring brings them back. Or which one is it again?
Well, he doesn't understand it. That's what we discover, is
Yeah.
that he thinks one goes one way and the other comes back. And
Yeah, one is the outward ring from the
Right.
wood between the worlds, and one is a homeward ring.
Yeah.
right,
So
right.
he doesn't understand his own magic.
Yeah. So
Right.
they get transported to this world between the worlds, which is a very fascinating
Yeah.
place that they go. I kind of wish we could explore it more. And then they end up in this ruined civilization, and they stumble across this hall of images. And I
Right.
wanted to talk
Let's
about
go
the
back
hall of...
to the world between the
Oh, okay.
worlds before
All right.
they get there.
Yeah.
I was wondering, and I don't know if you've talked about this in your Narnia book, David, but it struck me as the world between the worlds. So the yellow
wood between the worlds.
wood between the worlds, yeah.
Wood between the worlds.
The yellow ring takes them there, and then the green ring takes them to other places. But I wondered, since they just felt such contentment there, it's like time stops, and 3 times you get repeated the idea that you could almost hear the trees growing and the trees sucking up water. If that is like the destination of Sensuk, of sweet desire, but Lewis is saying that, no, that's not the ultimate destination. People mistake the desire, but that is just a means. Sensuk is a way to get to the truly real realm of Narnia.
Well, I think Lewis got some of this idea. The title came from something liked by William Morris called The Wood at the End of the World. This is the wood between the worlds.
Oh, okay.
But he read a book that he really liked by Algernon Blackwood called The Education of Uncle Paul. And Paul is staying with his niece and nephew, and they say, would you like to go to the crack between yesterday and tomorrow?
Oh, wow.
So right at the crack of midnight, they take him into this world, which is a very quiet place of growing trees and a river. And in the education of Uncle Paul, it's a symbol of the imagination. That it's not a place itself, but it's the midwife of all other places. Well, I love, we're about to jump into another pool, and suddenly Polly says, wouldn't we mark the original pool?
Yeah.
And they both realize, what would it be like if you had these infinite number of worlds and you couldn't get back to your own world?
Oh, my gosh.
That was it. He has great psychology, not only of children, but it wasn't really thematically important, but it's just interesting psychology. You get so excited about jumping into another pool.
Yeah.
Well, and
forget
of
to
course,
mark.
how they got to the wood between the worlds, and with the yellow ring and then the green ring into another world. Have you thought of the colors of the rings?
Oh, do they mean anything?
Well, I think they do.
Oh, I thought it was just that green, there was the R and it was in his right pocket. That was
That's
as far
right.
as I thought.
Well, that's how they remembered it. You have the green, which actually gets you. That's the go color to a new world. And the yellow is the in-between. It reminds me of street signals, because when they get to this other world, the first thing they notice is how red it is. And it is where life has stopped. And they see all these figures that are frozen.
Yeah.
So it's like the green, yellow, and red. And that goes way back. I actually looked it up, and those colors were experimented with in the 19th century for trains. And then by 1920, they were starting to use them as motor cars. Actually, they realized they needed something even for horse and buggies for cross streets. And so they experimented a while. And by 1936, those colors, green, yellow, red, became standardized signals. So I just wonder, since the green, yellow, and red are just all together in that one chapter, if he might have been
Well,
thinking
there's another
something.
strange parallel with the Out of the Silent Planet, because in the Ransom trilogy, Mars is an older world, which is the red planet.
Yeah.
Earth is in the middle, and then Venus is a new world. and he uses the word green a lot. So it's the same thing. Earth is a middle world. Charn is an old dying world, which is more red.
Yeah.
And then Narnia is a brand new world, which is dominated by the green grass.
Huh. Yeah.
So
they're
yeah, the
all
color
related.
imagery is definitely worth looking at.
I always give Lewis a hard time for getting his science wrong, but I want to give him credit here because he gives Charn a red sun, which is actually what happens.
A dying sun.
Yeah, when our sun dies, it will turn red and expand. And so I when I read that as an older adult, knowing about stars and stuff, I go, well, good for you, Lewis. You got one science fact right.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny that the two kids, when they're trying to figure out how far they need to go in the in-between place, I love the analogy between this attic that puts together all the row houses and that's the in-between place of all the worlds.
Yeah.
But when they try to figure out how far to go, they totally miscalculate. He was terrible at math.
Yeah.
So it's, once again, it's a little bit of Lewis
Childhood.
and Digory there.
But then also, wasn't there something similar in the attic of the house he grew up in?
Well, they love to go to the little end room. When he goes up to visit
He and
Polly's, he and his brother, and they had pictures and they made things and they had books. So her little pirate's cove that she has going up there
Yeah. He had a
is
room
very
like that?
similar to their little end room, right?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
They were so into
more
it.
of the childhood that occurs in this novel.
Well, they both missed their childhood so badly that Warren actually wanted to create a replica of the little end room at the kilns. And Lewis had to say, we're both into our 30s now. I think they had the ceremonial burial after their father died. They went back and buried all their toys and things that meant so much to them as children, kind of saying we need to put that behind us and move on to adulthood.
Oh my gosh, that's so heartbreaking.
Yeah, it is really heartbreaking.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, let's. We're at Charn now. The sun is. The world is dying, and they come upon this hall of images. And I wanted to talk about the figures there. Lewis describes them as having all these robes on, and it reminded me of that hideous strength and the robes that they put on towards the end of the novel.
Those are the good people that are putting on festive robes.
Yeah.
Obviously,
they're different in terms of the people,
Right.
but the idea of being sort of dressed in these resplendent
royal garbs.
robes.
Yeah.
Right.
But that would be just basic British signifiers.
Oh, well, that's what I was
idea
going to ask.
of the monarch, the people
is
who
it a
are in
monarch
charge wear crowns and jewels and these
Gotcha.
fantastic robes. So it becomes an indicator of power, but their power is lost, obviously.
I was thinking maybe it was a medieval thing.
Well, except they still do it in England, as we know.
Okay.
Let's have this dynamic where you all keep guessing and then I'll tell you where it comes from.
David,
Okay.
tell us, David.
In one of his favorite novels, he liked Rider Haggard, the adventure story writer.
Uh-huh.
And there's a hall of chieftains where they've all these petrified statues, which represents all the great leaders of the tribe.
Okay.
And in Rider Haggard's he meets this beautiful but evil woman called Yesha, who they all call She Who Must Be Obeyed. I mentioned this earlier when Crystal likes that title for herself.
Crystal, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Dem fine woman, she who must be obeyed.
But they meet She in a ruined city in Africa, and the narrator says it was like a charnel house because there was so much dead around them. And so this world is called Charn. So
what does this charnel mean? What does that mean?
I mean,
It's like
flesh.
chili con carne. So charn means flesh.
It's the same root as same carnal.
Yeah. And there is that the CH and C go back and forth between French and English. So you have a channel and a canal. So sometimes they use a CH, sometimes a C, or a cap and a chapeau.
Yes, there's a number of those doublets. Some of them come straight to us from Latin.
Right.
The other ones come through French, so they add an H sound.
Huh.
Let's turn this podcast into a game show.
Okay,
Where do you think you got the idea for and then you can both I go,
What gets wrong?
Sorry.
Well, so here are all these figures that Aaron astutely brought up, dressed in their robes, but are frozen solid. And then there is the bell that Digory can't help ringing. So it's on a pedestal, and Polly is always the one who has the wisdom, the common sense, the
voice of reason.
restraint.
Right.
Yeah.
And Digory just has this need to ring the bell. He just cannot control himself, which of course releases the witch, which ultimately will bring evil even into the newly created Narnia. So why a bell releasing the witch?
That I don't know.
Oh, no.
I'm not aware.
See, I was going to guess that it was the Liberty Bell. And no, I'm just kidding. I have no idea.
Well,
I do love the poem that he writes, The Little Enchantment. And he has this line where he says, it sounded better when you read it in that world, as if he's making an excuse for his poetry.
About the stranger and the danger. And,
Yeah.
Right.
Well, he's going to grow up to be Professor Kirk, so he's very curious. As you say, Polly has much better instincts. She can tell right away that Uncle Andrew is not right.
Right.
And when they first get to the world, she says, I don't like this place.
Right. And she has suspicions of Jadis right from the start,
Right.
whereas Digory is just so infatuated with her.
Well, he sees her as beautiful, and
Right.
it says that she didn't really see that at all. There was nothing special about her. Yeah.
Right.
Chris and I do that, though. I'll go, wow, that actress. Chris goes, I don't think she's so good looking. So you don't have to go to Charn to experience
This
this.
is true.
Yeah.
There's also a theme that pops up here that I think kind of is in the novel that maybe, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'll guess here, is of wonder, because Digory says, I wonder, 3 times. And the word wonder is in the poem. And then later on, he says, like, I don't want to go on wondering the rest of my life, wondering what would have happened. And it's not just curiosity, but going down that rabbit trail of what could have happened.
Right.
And that theme, I think, pops up in other Chronicle of Narnia stories. And so you have that line from Prince Caspian where he tells the children to know what would have happened, child. No, nobody is ever told that. But at the end, he does actually tell him what would have happened if he would have taken the apple and given it to his mother. So I feel like that's also a theme of wonder and how it can lead you down a path of doing something wrong.
Right.
Which
Which
justifying
ties-
a temptation in your head.
Yeah, ties into the whole theme of magic and magicians. You could say that magicians are people who have this wonder that leads them to make self-serving choices, to understand how things work, to manipulate reality, which of course is Uncle Andrew. And obviously Digory has the same DNA as Uncle Andrew. So you almost have a feeling that his attraction to that bell, even though he has no sense of consequences, shows he could have ended up in the same self-serving Nietzschean Ubermensch as Uncle Andrew, who cares about nobody else except trying to satisfy his own wonder.
Yeah.
Well, Lewis said that in the ancient wisdom was to try to conform your will to reality, but the new wisdom, which manifested both as science and as magic, is to try to get reality to conform itself to your will. And so the magic obviously is an attempt to conform reality to your will. Even though I don't know why the bell exactly, that's actually kind of his Garden of Eden moment, especially when Polly doesn't want to hit the bell and he forces her away from it and strikes it almost out of spite.
With violence.
With
He
violence,
almost
yeah.
hurt her.
Well, and they kind of almost it's like the manifest of the fall on our world sort of leads them into that moment because I wanted to read this line because it really stands out when Digory, he kind of becomes misogynistic and he says to Polly, that's all you know. It's because you're a girl. Girls never want to know anything about anything but gossip and rot and about people getting engaged.
Yeah.
And then he grabs the hammer and there's just this
Let me
tension.
get her reply. She says, you look so much like Uncle Andrew when you said
That's
that.
right.
Yeah.
That's
His
right.
female characters always have a good comeback.
Yeah.
It's not the male will say something misogynistic, but the female does a good job with her riposte. So I just want
And
to
it's
add
part
that.
of the male's evil, especially in this novel, that the more evil males are misogynistic.
Yeah. Well, and you see that, I think, also in Lewis's novels where instead of doing what these male figures should be doing, which is being stewards and helping other people, they choose to take power for themselves, or he grabs her by the hand and rings the bell, against her will, against her consent. There's definitely that way that Lewis portrays men going wrong in the stories.
But we do have wonderful female villains.
Right. So it's not this simplistic binary where men are evil and women are good. He mixes it up, but I like that he mixes it up.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about Jadis. We've talked about her previously. But there's this narrative that we learn about the fall of Charn and the Deplorable Word.
Oh, yeah.
Let's talk about that. What's going on with the Deplorable Word and this whole battle between the two sisters? And she pours the blood of her armies out like water before she uses the word. Where did that come from, David?
Well, in some ways, she takes Andrew to the logical extreme of total power. She has a magic which can destroy everything but herself. Once again, there's a sequel to She in which Ayesha and her sister do battle.
Oh.
But he almost always takes sources. When you read the original source, they're not nearly as good as Narnia. So she just recounts how she was willing to destroy everything rather than to lose this war.
Yeah.
And I can't remember which of the children says, well, it's rather hard luck on them, isn't it? All the men and women and children.
Yeah.
The same thing came up in Silver Chair when Rieling is saying, and then we're going to come out of the earth and we're going to surprise them and we're going to take over their world. And Eustace says, well, that's kind of hard luck on them, isn't it?
Yeah.
So the little children, there's often this very basic compassion, which is sounder than all these grand schemes of these people who want to master the world.
And once again, we have to remember that Lewis was writing these not that long after World War II when Hitler and the Nazis were hoping to conquer the world.
Yeah, I don't mean to jump ahead, but when Aslan warns them at the very end about there will be a deplorable word in your own world, some people think, now he's writing this well into the 50s, that he's thinking about the atom bomb.
I was going to say,
The ultimate weapon.
The terrible price.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because Jada says essentially that she learned this secret of secrets and that she paid a terrible price to learn this deplorable word. And then she uses it to destroy everything.
Right.
Yeah.
And you get the sense that Uncle Andrew almost goes down that path, and Digory has the temptation to go down that path with taking the apple. Because at the end of the story, Aslan essentially says, yeah, it would have healed your mother, but it would have turned your world into a world like Charn as opposed to a kindly world like Narnia. And so there's this idea that like you have a choice to go down one or these other paths, but the question is, what are you willing to do in order to secure that for yourself, and what is it going to cost other people along the path?
You're right. This is the only time in the Narnia Chronicles when Aslan tells them about this alternative reality.
Yeah.
Normally when they say what would have happened, Aslan says, well, you can't ask that. Just deal with things as they are.
Yeah.
But I think this is the one exception in all of Narnia. The deplorable word, in Arthurian legend, there is a very important moment called the dolorous stroke, when these two brothers, Balin and Balin, are battling in the dark and they don't realize they're fighting their own brother. And so when one of them kills the other, that's the beginning of the unraveling of the Round Table and Camelot. And it's often called the dolorous stroke with capital letters. So I think there's a little bit this one terrible thing that destroys that world. I think he's playing with this Arthurian motif of the dolorous stroke.
It is an interesting concept that he puts in there, which is this idea of there may be something you can do that would be good for you or the people that you love, but it may cause others pain. And are you willing to forego that for the better of everyone as opposed to just yourself? And that to me, I think that's a very relevant moral choice. And I see people all the time justifying the things they do because they say, oh, well, some good came out of it, you know?
Right.
And you go, yeah, but at what cost? You know,
Right.
Or often they'll say, well, it was good for my family. It was a good, and once again,
right.
they're only taking one strand out of the Tao and not looking, is it good for everybody?
Right. It's like, it's good to perpetuate my DNA.
I have to throw in one more literary allusion, which is fairly minor, but in Edith Nesbit, there's a story called The Story of the Amulet, where the children go off to Babylon and they accidentally meet the Queen of Babylon and bring her back to London. And there's all this chaos that ensues when the Queen of Babylon comes to London.
Gotcha.
And I believe when they try to escape Charn and she grabs onto Polly's hair and comes back to London.
Yeah.
But one time I was lecturing on Narnia, and I said, this whole idea of bringing back this terrible, beautiful queen to London, he may have gotten the idea from the Edith Nesbit story called The Story of the Amulet. And one of my students was asking me a question after class, and she was showing him her notes, and she had Edith Nesbit, The Story of the Omelet. Oh, that sounds like a really great fantasy story, you know. Eat this, try the omelet with the cheese and the... So I'm so glad I saw her notes. She'd go around thinking that
definitely
came from this,
especially when she goes to Google that, the story of the omelet, and she get a cookbook or something. So they come back to England, and then there's this whole chaotic scene where Queen Jadis gets out, and they end up going to try and get her out of our world. They try and grab her and take her back, and they end up taking a cabbie and a horse and the Queen back, and then Uncle Andrew, and that sets up one of the best scenes, I think, in the whole series, which is the creation of Narnia.
Oh, yeah. It's wonderful.
Let's talk a little bit about that. What was the inspiration for that, and what is Lewis trying to portray here in the creation of Narnia? Is interesting because he has Aslan singing instead of the word that you see in Genesis.
Right.
So what's going on there with Aslan and singing and the creation of Narnia?
Well, there's that verse in Job that we mentioned earlier that says, were you there when the morning stars sang together and the sons of God sang for joy or shouted for joy?
Yeah.
And I believe Tolkien in the Silmarillion has a very similar scene where Iluvatar tells them to sing, and as they sing, things come into being.
Yeah.
I can't remember if Lewis had read the Silmarillion. By this time, he definitely knew the Lord of the Rings. I don't know if he dived into the Silmarillion, but there's that same motif of singing creation into being.
Well, can't it even tie into something that Lewis was very familiar with, the whole tradition of the music of the spheres, that the stars, as they go around the earth, create music. And that goes way back to Pythagoras and his idea that just as music operates according to mathematical principles, so does astronomy. And so many people attribute that idea, the music of the spheres, to him. But then the medievals loved that idea because it presents this sense of God creating this symphony through creation, which goes back to the idea we have touched on multiple times, the idea of the dance. So the music of the spheres is like the dance of the stars, and it is a cosmos that reflects God's glory. Lewis has this ability, and we'll talk about this in the last novel of the Narnia Chronicles, where he talks about heaven. And here, talking about creation, just making it feel glorious as you read it. We've become inured to, and God said, let there be light. And God said, and all that. And you lose the sense of its glory. But to provide a counterpoint to the two magicians, Jadis and Uncle Andrew, who repeat the exact same phrase, who basically want to control reality. The king and queen of Narnia are these lowly, working class people. And the cabbie, Frank, who is so humble and just doesn't think highly of himself at all, which of course fulfills a biblical principle.
Means that he should be the one in charge.
Yeah, exactly. And so true of Lewis, he comes from the country and loves nature. But then when his wife is just... Aslan automatically transports her into Narnia, and she still has soap suds on her hands. And that is just such a beautiful image of she was just in the middle of doing her work, and now she's going to be the queen of Narnia. I get teary just thinking about it.
Well, I also love the metaphor when she suddenly appears. He said, didn't need any of those tiresome rings. She just appeared like a bird returning to its nest. It's a great metaphor, a natural metaphor for her sudden appearance. The name Frank, I should throw in, he wrote about in Studies in Words. It has a long history. It originally meant referring to the French, the Franks. But in English, it tended to mean noble or of high rank because the French came over in the Norman Conquest and took over England. So Frank originally meant noble, gentle, of the upper classes. And then it came to mean candid or honest or straightforward. So it's fascinating that this guy's name is Frank, which we think of as a very common name, but etymologically it's associated with royalty and aristocracy.
Yeah, because it's if somebody was named Frank, you don't think like, oh, he must be royalty. It does sound very kind of blue collar.
We've lost the etymology.
It's not like, and what's the cabbie's name? My name is Nigel.
Exactly.
It's Algernon, if you don't mind.
William. So then Digory and Polly and Fledge, who becomes a flying horse, or is it a Pegasus, or what is he?
Yeah, he's a Pegasus. He was Strawberry, which is a common English name for a horse, which is chestnut with a little bit of white. They look kind of pinkish.
Oh,
So
okay.
you'll meet strawberries if you go to England or in other English literature.
Oh, and they're actually called that.
Well, because of the color. Yeah, they look kind of like a pinkish brown.
Okay.
And his wings were the same color when he grew wings. When he changes his name to Fledge, that means feathered. Like full-fledged means fully feathered, or a fledgling is just getting its feathers.
Gotcha.
So once it becomes a flying horse, there's a name change there. We talked about Genesis. I love where he says to Fledge, Aslan says, "Is it good?" And Fledge says, "Oh, it's very good."
Yeah, very good.
But it's kind of like every day in creation when God says he saw that it was good.
Yeah.
And also, he is, Lewis, and I don't know if he's intentional about this, but he is reflecting much more of the Hebrew original of the creation story, where a tradition developed within the early church, medieval church, of creation ex nihilo, that creation was out of nothing.
Yeah.
But Hebrew scholars indicate, well, in the Hebrew, that's not what it means. That first chapter of Genesis isn't creation ex nihilo. It's God. There was already matter there that God gives purpose.
Yeah.
And
brings order to.
Right.
Yeah.
To.
Tohu vabohu.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Bohu.
Exactly.
Formless and void stuff that is sort of shaped and turned.
I wish
into
somebody would name their twins Tohu and Bohu.
Please don't do that.
Our colleague John Walton at Wheaton does a wonderful commentary on Genesis.
Yeah.
It's taking something that's useless and formless and like a field and giving it form and operational functionality.
Right. And so then tying that in to this piece of the lamppost that the witch throws at Aslan and it hits him right in the face, but then drops into the ground and grows into the lamppost.
Yeah.
So that's where the lamppost came from. He finally answered Roger Lancelin Green's question.
Right.
Another thing about that creation scene, just like when they first heard the name Aslan and Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, the three people who have a better spiritual nature respond very positively. Remember the three children.
Yeah.
But Edmund has this negative, sickly feeling.
Yeah.
And when we first see Aslan, none of them know who he is or what his moral nature
you mean
is in this story.
Yeah.
novel?
When they first see him. And the children and the cabbie immediately respond positively.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's a very wondrous experience of awe and splendor.
Yeah.
Whereas
the
Uncle
witch and Uncle Andrew
can't even understand what the talking animals are saying.
Right.
He is so out of touch with nature because he is trying to control nature
Yeah.
as a magician
Yeah.
rather than participate in
Yeah.
nature. And so he can't get it.
Yeah, and Lewis has a line in there after they come back from their trip to go get the apple, and Uncle Andrew is released from the
Right.
prison that he's in, and he has this line about how he's cut himself off from God so that he can't hear from God even if he wanted to, and that he's essentially all the things that man does to torture himself and cut himself off from God. And
it's
very
not
powerful.
God damning him. It's Uncle Andrew choosing.
Yeah.
Like Jadis.
All he would hear
choosing.
is roaring. He wouldn't
Right.
actually
Yes.
hear Aslan
Right.
speaking to him.
There was a line when they first start having different perceptions of what's happening during creation, where Lewis says, "For what you see and hear depends a good deal on where you are standing. It also depends on what sort of person you are."
Yes.
So this very common theme in Narnia is that preconceptions often shape your perceptions. We'll get to this again in Last Battle, where since he doesn't realize what's going on in Narnia, all he can hear is barking and all he hears the lion roaring.
Yeah.
He has another great line where he says, "The trouble is when you try to be stupider than you are, as you often succeed." So he never does figure out what's going on.
Yeah.
I love that scene. I'm skipping around here, but where they're trying to provide food to Uncle Andrew.
Right.
And the bear's like, "Well, I threw a whole bee's nest at him." And the squirrels throw nuts at him and stuff. And they're like, he just thinks he's being attacked.
Yeah.
Well, this is Lewis using fiction for emotional healing. I think this going back to Robert Capron. The same thing happens to Divine and Weston and Out of the Silent Planet.
Yeah.
They get humiliated.
Yeah, they get dunked. Their heads get dunked in cold water because their head there's too much blood on their head.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And he gets planted upside down because they think he's some kind of a tree.
But even then, Lewis doesn't kill off Uncle Andrew. He allows him
Yeah.
to become a slightly better man
Yeah.
at the end of
And
the
as
Yeah, he says
Aslan-
at
novel.
the very end, he was a
And-
little better.
Abzin gives him the only gift that he can give him, which is sleep.
Yeah.
Right.
That long night's sleep.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about the garden, and then we can wrap up. So they fly off to the garden
On
and
Fledge.
on Fledge, and it's very much a sort of Garden of Eden kind of a
Right.
situation. And the queen here is almost kind of like a Lilith figure, which we've talked about in previous
Right.
podcasts. And there's this inscription on the gate. What is Lewis's inspiration for the inscription on the gate? Because that's not something that's like scriptural. Where does that come from, and why is there a gate around it? It's this idea that it's private property, but it's the beginning of Narnia, so...
Do you all want to take a few guesses and then I'll tell you?
No, we just
Well,
want you to
David,
answer.
do you
Oh,
have
I
a
think
theory?
I do, as a matter of fact.
Oh, well, let's listen to you.
I think there should be an annotated Narnia, because a lot of these things, when there's going back to creation, when all these mounds are bubbling up and then
Oh,
animals come
right.
out,
Yeah.
that's
love
in
that.
Paradise Lost. So
Oh, it is?
he's
Oh,
taking
I
giving it a
forgot
very
that.
folksy, comical version.
Gotcha.
But once again, when you get to Eden in Paradise Lost, it is a garden. It's a walled, enclosed garden, which is a very important motif in Lewis.
Gotcha.
And it's a combination. When Jesus said the shepherd comes in through the gate, but the thief calls over the wall.
Uh-huh.
And Milton took that and he takes a walled garden, and Satan, when he's trying to get into the Garden of Eden to tempt Adam and Eve, he doesn't go through the gate, he crawls over the wall.
Oh.
So we're taking this Genesis motif, we're combining it with one of the sayings of Jesus, and he actually, Satan bites an apple and has this like dark stain of
Oh,
the
just
juice
like
from the
Jadis.
apple. Yeah.
Oh.
So she's very clearly a Satan figure here, and she actually says to that she can give Digory knowledge. If you'll take one of these for yourself, you can have knowledge. So this is Genesis through the prism of Paradise Lost.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, and I think that this is, once again, you can correct me if I'm guessing wrong, but it feels very much like Lewis is also bringing in the temptations of Christ that Satan does, because Satan tempts Jesus with turning stones into bread, and he's going to give him all the kingdoms. But Satan doesn't have authority over all the kingdoms, and so he sort of offers to give something to Jesus that's not his. And Jadis kind of does that with Digory. She's like, "Here, I'll give you this
Yeah.
knowledge, and
Right.
I'll
Yeah.
provide this for you," as if it's hers to give when she's clearly eating stolen fruit
Right.
herself.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you mentioned the inscription at the gate about take an apple for someone else, but not for yourself.
Yeah.
I'm sensing here, I'm not going to play Alex Trebek, rest in peace. I'm sensing Charles Williams' idea of co-inherence, that often you can't do it for yourself. You can only do it for someone else. So I love this scene because we get the Pegasus motif, but we get Genesis, but we get Jesus talking about the sheepfold.
Yeah.
But there's a little bit of Charles Williams.
And
then there's
Milton.
And Milton. And then let's throw in a phoenix sitting in the tree, the big colored bird, which is
Yeah.
a symbol of resurrection.
Yeah, he just
Right.
throws that in there for free.
Yeah.
It's just,
So here's a children's story, which you could literally write 15-page source analysis on a chapter from a children's story.
yeah, definitely. Well, I want to talk about a specific moment, and then we can maybe wrap up. I wanted to mention the exchange they have when they're flying to the place. They have to sleep for the night, so they stop, and Fledge is just eating grass because he's a horse, and he's like, this grass is pretty
Heck,
good.
It's great. Yeah,
you
go
guys-
ahead, you guys.
Come on, why don't
And
you
they're
join
like-
me?
They're like, yeah, we're good. And he says, they're sort of arguing there, and they basically like, well, why didn't Aslan give us food? And they have this exchange, and Fledge says, I'm sure Aslan would have given you food if you'd asked him. And then he said, I'd be no doubt he would, said Fledge, but I've a sort of idea that he likes to be asked.
Oh.
And so this idea of there are a lot of things that God would give us if we would just ask for them. So this is, once again, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, David, but I think Lewis is echoing some of the themes from George MacDonald's unspoken sermon called The Word of Jesus on Prayer. And it's on Luke 18:1 and the parable of the persistent widow. And it deals with a lot of themes that I think resonate with Lewis. He quotes a lot from this in his anthology on George MacDonald, and deals with some of these themes in Letters to Malcolm, which feels like he was wrestling with these and this idea of unanswered. Why didn't God answer his prayers for his mother? Because he did ask. But MacDonald is asking this question in that sermon of, well, why do we have to ask for things? And why do we have needs that have to be, that we have to ask for in the first place? Why doesn't God just provide everything that we need? And his message in that sermon is basically, it's because the deepest need we have is communion with God. And what he really wants to give us is himself. And the things that he gives us are just a way of giving us himself. And so he wants us to ask. And so there's a line he has in there. MacDonald says, God withholds that man may ask. And the point of us asking and him giving is, he says, when in all gifts we find him, then in him we shall find all things.
Oh, nice.
Oh, that is great. Yeah.
And he says, he gives an example in the sermon of a child, and this feels very much like it's something that's happening in the story, and a child and his mother. And he says, hunger may drive the runaway child home, and he may or may not be fed at once, but he needs his mother more than his dinner. Communion with God is the one need of the soul beyond all other need. And that idea of what does the child need most of all is he needs his mother. And this theme of, Lewis clearly, wrestling with his mother's death when he was a child, and, Digory is tempted to take the apple for his mother. And it reminded me, we were talking earlier, of Julian of Norwich's refrain. And so she has this vision, and Jesus says, it was necessary that there should be sin, but all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And it's this idea that the sin that happens can actually lead to good things in the end. And so you have Digory, and he sins by, ringing the bell, and it sets off this whole chain of events. And yet in the end, it leads to the creation of Narnia and all of these other things. And in the end of the story, his mother is healed. Aslan does actually answer his prayer.
But not the way he would have thought.
Yeah, and things get better and better and better in the story. And so that to me stood out to me when I read this last time, is this idea of unanswered prayer. And why do we have to ask for things in prayer? It's because God wants to give us himself. He doesn't want to just give us things. What stood out to you guys? Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about?
Well, can I add to your passage? Well, in many ways, all of the I am passages in John are making the same point. They say, well, how can we find a way to heaven? Like, give us a map. And Jesus says, well, I'm the way, the truth, and the life.
Yeah.
Well, how can we get this bread? Well, all of those I am statements are,
I'm the bread.
Don't look at the gifts I could give you. Look at what it would be like to be in a relationship with me. I want to read a passage so they remembered. This is right at the end when Aslan tells them to be careful about the deplorable word in their own world. And then he says, both children were looking up into the lion's face as he spoke these words, and all at once, they never knew exactly how it happened. The face seemed to be a sea of tossing gold in which they were floating, and such a sweetness and power rolled about them and over them and entered them that they felt they had never really been happy or wise or good, or even alive and awake before. And the memory of that moment stayed with them always, so that as long as they both lived, if ever they were sad or afraid or angry, the thought of all that golden goodness and the feeling that it was still with them, quite close, just around some corner or behind some door, would come back and make them sure deep down inside that all was well. I love that passage. To me, that's sin-soaked, but that's the comfort of faith. And going back to that moment, and he ends with that phrase you just mentioned from Julian of Norwich, that all was well. That's my closing thought on.
And I think that's a good place to close.
All right. So what are we reading after The Magician's Nephew?
The Last Battle.
All right. The Last Battle. We'll talk about that next time.
Take care.
You.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu. or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.